This lecture is on University of Colorado Boulder philosophy professor David Boonin and his book, Should Race Matter? David Boonin addresses the question, does the government currently owe slave reparations to blacks? There are those who believe the government does. White people are currently better off than black people. White people are doing better financially, in education, and in their health. Black incarceration rates are roughly 8 times higher than for whites. Boonin says this is at least partly due to injustices done by this country to blacks through slavery and Jim Crow laws. Boonin in his book defines the slave reparations position as the U.S. government has a moral obligation to benefit the current generation of African Americans because of the wrongful harms that were inflicted on past generations of Africans and African Americans by the institution of slavery and its aftermath. Boonin's position is the government owes at least some reparations to the current generation of Black Americans. The contemporary debate over slave reparations is not whether slave owners would owe debts to slaves themselves who were unjustly exploited so many years ago, but whether such debts can meaningfully be handed down to future generations. Do we now owe a debt to today's blacks because of injustices of the past? In maintaining the U.S. government has a moral duty to benefit the current generation of African Americans, the slave reparation position does not take any particular stance on how this reparation can be most effectively achieved. Some examples of how it could be achieved is more money spent on job training for blacks, through more money spent on public schools in the inner city, by government contracts for minority-owned businesses, through college scholarships for blacks, or through interest-free mortgages and small business loans. David Boonin addresses the popular unjust enrichment argument in favor of slave reparations. He describes the principle of unjust enrichment as if someone unlawfully enriches himself by wrongful acts against another, then that person who is wronged is entitled to recompense. One person should not be enriched at the expense of another. Unjust enrichment applied to slave reparations maintains white Americans have unjustly enriched themselves off of slavery and its aftermath. Thus, reparation needs to be done from this unjust enrichment. Critics against the unjust enrichment argument for slave reparations argue that even if it is true contemporary white Americans are somehow profiting today from the legacy of slavery and its aftermath through intergenerational wealth, contemporary white Americans did not do the wrongful acts that they're now profiting from. Also, the black people who were wrongfully harmed are now dead. Defenders argue white Americans are still unjustly profiting and need to give their unjust profit back somehow, that the unjust profit should be given to the black descendants of those harmed. Boonin describes a thought experiment that a defender of the unjust enrichment argument could use to demonstrate that unjust profit should be given to the black descendants of those harmed. Suppose you're an artist away on vacation and a shadowy figure breaks into your house and steals your paintings. The crook then brings them to the art gallery, says the paintings are his, and offers to allow them to be displayed and charge admission for people to come and view them. Most would say that upon finding out they were stolen, the gallery manager would need to give both the paintings back to you, the original artist, as well as the money that was made charging admission for people to see your paintings. There are those who would say this is on par with whites being unjustly enriched by the slavery of blacks and its aftermath. That today's white Americans are like the gallery manager, receiving enrichment due to an injustice, and just as the gallery manager is obligated to give back the wealth he received unjustly, white Americans need to give back the wealth they have received unjustly. Supporters of the unjust enrichment argument can argue that slave labor contributed to developing the infrastructure of the early United States. In that way, white Americans were made better off at the expense of black slaves. Boonin doesn't find the unjust enrichment through slave labor argument to be very convincing. Just because a practice was profitable doesn't mean it was beneficial for society as a whole. Slavery led to the Civil War, which was destructive economically. The legacy of slavery and its aftermath has exerted a poisonous influence on this country. It's left white Americans better off than black Americans in terms of relative well-being. However, it's plausible white Americans as well as black Americans are worse off than they would have been if slavery had never occurred. Political activist David Horowitz talks about how if slave labor created wealth for Americans, then obviously it has created wealth for contemporary black Americans as well, including the descendants of slaves. Contemporary American blacks, on average, enjoy incomes in the range of 20 to 50 times that of blacks living in any of the African nations from which they were kidnapped. Thus, while white Americans have unjustly been enriched by slavery, so have black Americans. Assuming unjust enrichment really did take place, Boonin says, which currently living black Americans would actually be entitled to reparations? According to the unjust enrichment argument, only the descendants of those slaves who were used profitably would be owed reparations. Since the reason for the government to give blacks reparation money, according to the unjust enrichment argument, is because America was unjustly enriched by the profitable work of slave labor, not slave labor that was unprofitable. Thus, those who descend from slaves who were treated relatively well and produced sufficient wealth would be owed reparations, while those who descend from slaves who were beaten so badly they could not produce any wealth are owed nothing. But why should it matter if a slave was forced to pick valuable cotton all day or carry heavy rocks pointlessly from one end of the field to another all day when it comes to slave reparations? Boonin says modifying the art gallery example can be used against the unjust enrichment argument. Suppose I own a coffee shop next to an art gallery. For months, business has been slow. But then, a new exhibit opens up at the gallery next door, and crowds of people come streaming into the new exhibit. When they leave the new exhibit, many of them stop by my shop for a cup of coffee. My profits at the coffee shop are now 5 times greater. Now let's say that after the art exhibit at the profitable art gallery next door closes, a startling discovery is made. The gallery owner, without realizing it, had been exhibiting stolen paintings, and as a result, the woman who had actually painted them had not received a penny from him. It seems reasonable to say the art gallery owner would owe the artist the money he earned from showing her paintings. But would I, the coffee shop owner next door, who earned more money while the exhibit was going on, have to give up the extra money I made to the artist? Boonin says no. Thus, if white Americans are profiting from the labor that slaves performed without consent and compensation in the past, the way in which we are benefiting is more like the coffee shop owner benefiting from the exhibit of the artist's stolen paintings than it is like the art gallery himself benefiting from exhibiting them. While David Boonin rejects the unjust enrichment argument for slave reparations, Boonin does accept the compensation argument for slave reparations. The compensation argument is defended in 5 steps. The first step is the compensation principle. The second step, the historical claim. The third step is the causal chain. The fourth step is the surviving public obligation principle. The fifth step is the unpaid balance claim. Step 1 of the compensation argument is the compensation principle. This is If a government wrongfully harms someone as a result of the authorized actions of some of its public officials, then it incurs a moral obligation to compensate its victims for the harms that it has wrongfully caused. Step 2 of the compensation argument is the historical claim. And the historical claim is, in the past, the U.S. government wrongfully harmed the previous generations of Africans and African Americans by supporting the institution of slavery and subsequent forms of legalized segregation and discrimination. Step 3 of the compensation argument is the causal claim. The causal claim holds the acts by which the U.S. government wrongfully harmed previous generations of Africans and African Americans by supporting the institution of slavery and subsequent forms of legalized segregation and discrimination in the past continue to cause harmful consequences for the currently living generation of Black Americans today. Step 4 of the compensation argument is the surviving public obligation principle. The surviving public obligation principle holds if a government incurs a moral obligation as a result of the authorized actions of some of its public officials, then this obligation doesn't cease to exist when the officials in question die. Step 5 of the compensation argument is the unpaid balance claim. The unpaid balance claim is that the U.S. government has not yet fully compensated the currently living generations of Black Americans for the harmful consequences they continue to incur as a result of slavery and its aftermath. Boonin defends the first step of the argument, the compensation principle. Boonin understands the compensation principle as if someone wrongfully harms another person, then he incurs a moral obligation to compensate his victim for the harms that he has wrongfully caused. Boonin sees this compensation principle as something that can be easily accepted by everyone. Therefore, the government has a moral obligation to compensate its victims for the harms it has wrongfully caused. Boonin acknowledges that even most opponents of slave reparations accept the legitimacy of reparations that the government made to specific Japanese American victims of internment camps in World War II. Step 2 of the argument is the historical claim that the U.S. government wrongfully harmed African and African Americans by supporting slavery and subsequent forms of legalized segregation. An objection to the second step of the argument is that while we know now that slavery was wrong, the people who participated in it didn't know it at the time. Boonin's response to the objection is a denial that its true slavery was generally seen as acceptable when the United States was founded. Boonin believes there is evidence for serious reservation about slavery. Also, Boonin says the compensation principle does not say that if someone wrongfully harms another person, then he incurs a moral obligation to compensate his victim as long as he knows what he's doing is wrong. Boonin gives an example to demonstrate that acting out of ignorance doesn't necessarily excuse someone from the duty to make reparation. Suppose when I ripped up your coat, I had no idea what I was doing was wrong. I mistakenly confused it with a coat I bought at the thrift shop. Even if I mistakenly believed that I had the right to rip it up, I still owe you compensation for ripping up your coat. A further objection to the historical claim is that if the Founding Fathers truly could not have adopted a constitution that prohibited slavery, and if once the Constitution was ratified, it effectively prevented the Congress and the President from doing anything about it either, then the Founding Fathers were not obligated to do anything to prevent slavery in the first place. Boonin's response is that the objection is too quick to conclude that the U.S. could not have been founded as a slavery-free country. At least some of the southern colonies would almost certainly have refused to join, if the Constitution had prohibited slavery, but most, if not all, the rest of the colonies would probably have agreed to form a new independent country. The U.S. would have likely had fewer states, but it could still have been successfully founded. The Founding Fathers could simply have decided not to start a new country in the first place, instead of one that permits and facilitates slavery. Step 3 for David Boonen's compensation argument is the causal claim. And Boonen defines the causal claim as the acts by which the U.S. government wrongfully harmed previous generations of Africans and African Americans by supporting the institution of slavery and subsequent forms of legalized segregation, and discrimination in the past continues to cause harmful consequences for the currently living generation of Black Americans today. The causal claim defends how Black American slaves who lived in the past, who would have been owed something, supports the claim that Black Americans who are alive today are owed something. The key to this step of the argument is the idea that an act that harms the members of one generation can have lingering consequences that impose costs on subsequent generations. For example, I wrongfully harm you by dumping toxic waste in your neighborhood. The hazardous effects of my polluting make people of the current generation sick, but also people for generations to come. Thus, I owe a debt not only to the people of the current generation, but also generations to come. If it could be shown slavery and its aftermath involved wrongful acts that polluted race relations in this country in ways that continue to cause harmful consequences for the current generation of Black Americans, then the move from a debt owed to those directly harmed by slavery and legalized segregation to those living today indirectly harmed by slavery and legalized segregation can be made. Boonen says there seems to be only two kinds of explanations available to account for the discrepancy between Black and white levels of well-being in this country: genetic differences or social environment. Boonen rejects genetic differences and embraces social environment. The social environment of Blacks makes it harder for them to flourish. The most obvious candidate for this difference is the legacy of slavery and its aftermath. An objection to the causal claim is that the present difficulties of Black Americans are not due to the legacy of slavery and its aftermath, but come from the Black culture. A Black culture has arisen that is harmful to Black Americans. There is pressure to embrace this Black culture, to be authentically Black, and fear that one will be shunned for acting white if they reject it. This Black culture encourages Black Americans to view themselves as passive victims of forces beyond their control. This culture is anti-intellectual and celebrates instant gratification and impulsiveness, not the autonomy necessary to thrive. In response to the objection, Boonen asks, but where did this Black culture come from? Why have so many Black Americans embraced this dysfunctional culture? Boonen sees the legacy of slavery and its aftermath as largely responsible. He appeals to a few ways the legacy of slavery and its aftermath could be contributing to Black culture. One way is that the anti-intellectual strain is inherited from whites having denied education of Blacks for centuries. Another, oppression conditions people away from all the values and attitudes one needs in freedom: individual initiative, self-interested hard work, individual responsibility, delayed gratification, and so on. Skepticism towards the values of whites may be a cultural stance that served Blacks well in the past. Blacks in the past who did try to assimilate into white society in the past found themselves scorned. Now the attitude of rejection seems to have set in. A further objection to the causal claim is that the non-identity problem poses a serious concern about the reparations position. Black Americans today seem to owe their very existence to the fact that wrongful acts took place before they were conceived. The black people who lived in America today aren't really worse off because of slavery because they wouldn't exist in the first place without it. For example, suppose several generations ago, a small plantation owner in Georgia purchased a male slave from one part of Africa and a female slave from another part of Africa. These two slaves went on to have 3 children, and John, a typical black teenager living today in Detroit, is one of their descendants. If the U.S. Constitution had prohibited slavery, it's virtually certain the 2 slaves would never have met, and John, living in Detroit, would never have existed. Thus, John, the typical black teenager living in Detroit, can't be owed anything in terms of slavery reparations because he wouldn't exist without slavery. Boonen's response to the non-identity objection is that what matters is that John exists, he is harmed by elements in his environment that are impeding his progress, and that it is the fault of the U.S. government that these harms took place. Thus, the U.S. government must be responsible for making reparation for these harms, even if John wouldn't have existed if it weren't for slavery. Boonen takes on a further objection that it would have been extremely difficult for anyone in the past to have foreseen the causal contribution that slavery and its aftermath would have on the difficulties of contemporary Black American life. The compensation principle should include some sort of condition requiring that the harm be reasonably foreseeable consequence of the government's act. Boonen sees a standard that requires a person to be able to anticipate precisely how his actions could lead to future harm as too strict to be reasonable. A person who wrongfully dumps an unmarked container of chemicals into the public water supply, for example, would be able to evade responsibility by pointing out that he was unable to foresee exactly what effect his actions would have. Boonen continues saying a standard that requires that a person be able to recognize that his act is the kind of act that has the potential to cause significant harm is a more reasonable one. There is no reason to think that this is not met in the case of slavery or Jim Crow, says Boonen, and uses an example. If I steal from you, and as a result, you are unable to pay your child's medical bills, virtually everyone would agree that it's fair to hold me responsible for the harm your child suffers, even though I only directly harmed you. And this example involves a causal connection that is similar to the way that the U.S. government is morally responsible for indirect harms it committed through slavery and Jim Crow. The fourth step in Boonen's compensation argument is the surviving public obligation principle. It attempts to move from the claim that the dead white men of yesterday would owe something to currently living Black Americans to the claim that contemporary white Americans like me owe something to currently living Black Americans. Boonen points out that slavery was not simply a private vice. It was legally recognized, legally protected, and legally facilitated practice by the government. So, for example, when a slave escaped to a free state in the North, the federal government actively enforced the legal right of the slave owner to have his property returned to him. Up until the landmark Brown versus the Board of Education, the federal government protected the rights of states to segregate their public schools in a manner that clearly disadvantaged Black school children. While a private moral debt can be canceled by the death of the person, the same can't be said for public moral debts. When a representative of the federal government, acting in his capacity as an agent of the state, does something that generates an obligation, it's not that he himself incurs the obligation, but rather the government does. When the U.S. signs a treaty, the government incurs certain obligations that would not have otherwise occurred. The U.S. government thus undergoes certain obligations even if its members prefer not to carry out those obligations. If the law raises the national speed limit, the speed limit doesn't go back down after the president who signs the law dies. When the federal government made reparations in the amount of $1.6 billion to approximately 80,000 Japanese Americans who had been unjustly interned by the government during World War II, few objected. These internment camps were created as a result of an executive order signed by President Franklin Roosevelt, and Roosevelt died long before the reparations were paid. An objection to the surviving public obligation principle is that it commits the fallacy of equivocation. The U.S. government that used to exist doesn't exist anymore. The U.S. government that exists today doesn't owe compensation for the wrongs the U.S. government in the past committed. Reasons given that the country today is different than the country that unjustly persecuted blacks are that the country is much larger than it was at the outset. The federal government was originally weaker, with more power given to the individual states. Many constitutional and legislative changes have been made since the end of the Civil War, especially those that pertain to the right of Black Americans to be treated equally. Boonin further says one way to see the problem with the equivocation objection is to look at the way we observe the changes in people. He gives the example of Uncle Sam. When Uncle Sam was a young man, he was physically frail, wielded little influence over others, and was a racist. Now he's middle-aged and made himself far stronger in body and mind, holds enormous power over others by his personality and vast financial fortune, and is now a civil rights advocate, having long ago repented of his youthful racial hatred. In cases like this, says Boonin, we often speak of someone as a whole different person. But this isn't meant literally. We don't mean that the old Uncle Sam literally died and a whole new person has now taken his place. If Uncle Sam took out a loan in his youth, he could not get out of paying the loan by insisting to the bank that he is now a completely different person from the person who took out the loan. Boonin says that the question of what constitutes a distinct national government seems to have a relatively straight answer. And that answer is the Constitution. We still have the same Constitution, so we still live in the same country. The fifth step of Boonin's compensation argument is the unpaid balance claim. Now, an objection that Boonin takes on to the unpaid balance claim is that there are those who say the government has already lived up to this responsibility of making reparation for the wrongs committed against Black Americans. It ended slavery, abolished segregation, protected voting rights, adopted various forms of affirmative action, and created other social programs that benefit Black Americans as well. Boonin responds to the objection by saying that if slave reparations have already been made, then Black Americans today would be doing as well as white Americans are doing. But they're not. An objection to slave reparations is that white Americans were not the only people responsible for slavery in America. Not all slaves in America were Black, and not all slave owners were white. America's role in the global tragedy of slave systems involving Africans, while bad enough, was relatively minor compared with the roles of Arabs, Europeans, and Africans themselves. Boonin says whether other groups did or didn't play a bigger role in slavery worldwide than the U.S. played doesn't have any bearing on whether the U.S. nonetheless owes a debt of reparation due to the particular role that it did play. Another objection to slave reparations is that the two great waves of American immigration occurred after 1880, then after 1960. What logic would require Vietnamese boat people, Russian refugeniks, Iranian refugees, Armenian victims of the Turkish persecution, Jews, Mexicans, Greeks, or Polish, Hungarian, Cambodian, and Korean victims of communism to pay reparations to Black Americans? Boonin says this is a good argument against the bloodline argument, but not against the compensation argument. Consider the case of obligations generated by the ratification of the NATO Treaty. Imagine a recent immigrant to the U.S. who is indignant at the thought of any of his hard-earned money should be used to help America fulfill its NATO obligations. The logic that requires the recent immigrant to bear his fair share of the burdens involved in America's fulfilling its obligations is simply the logic of citizenship. When you freely choose to become a citizen of a country, you incur a duty to help your country fulfill all its obligations, including those obligations that it incurred before you arrived. An objection to slave reparations is that it's one more attempt to turn African Americans into victims. It sends a damaging message to the African American community and to others. Boonen's response is that there's a difference between the claim that the U.S. does, in fact, have an obligation to make reparations to the currently living generations of Black Americans, and the claim that it would be a good idea for Black Americans to devote their time and energy to demanding such reparations. The fact that it would be a bad idea for someone to ask for something does not by itself establish that they are not entitled to receive it. For example, if a bully stole your bike, it might be a bad idea for you to demand that he return it, but surely you would have a right that he return it nonetheless. Boonen sees it as implausible that the government cannot make reparations to the Black community because of how high of a cost there would be in increasing the sense of victimhood of Black Americans. An objection to slave reparations is that even if we're sufficiently confident that Black Americans as a whole on average are doing less well today than Black Americans would be doing in the absence of a long history of slavery and legalized segregation and discriminations, we can't be confident to identify precisely which Black Americans are doing worse off as a result and which ones aren't. Even if every Black American is confronted with some sort of adverse social environment that no white American faces, some people might turn out to flourish more in the face of adversity than they would have under more comfortable circumstances. Boonen's response is that if there's no way for the federal government to directly compensate benefits to all and only those Black Americans who really are being adversely impacted by the lingering effects of slavery and Jim Crow, this is reason to conclude that the government is obligated to simply do the best it can to benefit those who are entitled to it, rather than reason to think it isn't obligated to do anything at all. A relevant objection is that if the U.S. is going to make slavery reparations, who's going to pay for it? Boonen's response is that the taxpayers are the ones who will be paying for slavery reparations. An objection to that is, if Black people should be benefited by being given reparations, why should Black people be burdened by paying for it? Boonen says that this doesn't pose a problem, for the same is true with veterans' benefits. The government makes various benefits available to veterans through our tax dollars, and veterans are among the people who pay taxes. It's also true of people who are paid by the government and also pay taxes to the government. Boonen addresses the objection of which Americans count as Black. Boonen concedes that this doesn't have an easy answer. That doesn't mean that we must reject the reparations position itself, says Boonen. In cases involving complex, widespread harms, it's almost always difficult to determine precisely who the victims are and precisely how much harm they have wrongfully suffered. For example, tobacco company lawsuits. It's impossible to know precisely which people have been harmed by smoking. That doesn't mean the companies don't have an obligation to make reparations. Without being able to determine who is Black and who isn't, the government could uncontroversially determine that some neighborhoods or schools are predominantly Black, that some crime victims are predominantly Black, and that some organizations have members that are predominantly Black, and so forth. This may not be the perfect way of ensuring all and only Black Americans are made better off, but it may be the best that could be done. A slave reparations objection is that it can start to seem then that reparation for Black Americans implies reparations for virtually everyone else, which in turn seems to provide a good reason to reject the case for reparations for Black Americans in the first place. Boonen's response is that although Irish, Italian, and Polish immigrants certainly suffered in many ways from a variety of private forms of wrongful treatment. They were not victims of sustained multi-generational injustices caused or facilitated by the U.S. government in the way that Black Americans and Native Americans were. Boonin moves on in his text from slave reparations to affirmative action. Affirmative action makes it possible for a qualified Black student to be admitted ahead of an otherwise better qualified white student, precisely because the Black student is Black and the white student is white. Affirmative action is controversial. Most people in the pro-affirmative action camp think it is a matter of justice to favor affirmative action policies and not just a nice thing to do. Most people in the anti-affirmative action camp think it's positively unjust, not just an unwise idea. Boonin believes affirmative action is not morally required or morally forbidden. He sees businesses, schools, and governments as free to practice it or not. Boonin utilizes geography-based affirmative action to justify his conclusion that affirmative action is not morally required or morally forbidden. Boonin says that geography-based affirmative action is permissible but not morally obligatory. He then says that the race-based affirmative action is morally on par with geography-based affirmative action. Therefore, race-based affirmative action is permissible but not morally obligatory. Developing his geography-based affirmative action argument, Boonin says geography-based affirmative action for the sake of diversity is morally permissible. There is no moral duty to engage in it, and no moral duty to not engage in it. For example, if Yale admits a less qualified applicant from North Dakota over a slightly better qualified student from New York, it is morally permissible. Boonin justifies that race-based affirmative action is morally on par with geography-based affirmative action by saying that geography-based affirmative action takes group membership into account rather than judging people solely on their individual merits, just as race-based affirmative action does. People can't control what country they were born and raised in, just as people can't help what color skin they were born with. Generalizations about people from different parts of the country aren't true of each person, just as generalizations pertaining to skin color aren't true of every person. Boonin addresses arguments we have a moral duty to practice affirmative action. He talks about the argument that we have a moral duty to practice affirmative action based on unfair disadvantages of Blacks in the past. Black Americans who apply for jobs and admission to schools in the present are unfairly disadvantaged by the effects of an unjust discrimination that took place in the past. White Americans today enjoy an unfair competitive advantage because of the misdeeds of white Americans of yesterday. Therefore, it would be morally wrong for those who evaluate applicants to fail to adjust for this fact in making their final decisions about which applicants to accept. Boonin agrees Blacks who apply for jobs are unfairly disadvantaged. However, Boonin disagrees it's morally wrong for people who evaluate applications to fail to adjust for this fact. He uses Bill and Ted as an example to demonstrate this. During freshman and sophomore years, Bill got somewhat better grades than Ted and did better on practice SAT tests. There was every reason to believe that Bill was going to be somewhat more qualified and better prepared for college than Ted by high school graduation. However, Bill's father gets unjustly framed the summer before his junior year. Bill's life became seriously disrupted. So Ted ended up with a somewhat better overall academic record than Bill in the end. Wouldn't an admission officer who finds out about Bill's misfortune be morally obligated to take Bill over Ted because of his misfortune? Boonin says no. Analogously, Ted has an unfair competitive advantage over Bill the way a white applicant has an unfair competitive advantage over a black applicant. Boonin addresses the principle of compensation argument in favor that we have a moral duty to practice affirmative action. The argument is that black applicants are owed compensation for past harms. Therefore, they are entitled to preferential treatment when their applicants are considered. Boonin accepts the first premise of the principle of compensation argument, but rejects the second. Boonin says when you wrongfully harm someone, you're morally obligated to compensate them for that harm. However, just because the government needs to provide some kind of compensation to blacks, it doesn't follow that they are morally obligated to make sure they receive jobs or admitted to schools ahead of more qualified white Americans. If the state of Illinois wrongfully harms a white teenager, the state may be obligated to pay for the student's room and board when he attends Illinois State. However, the state of Illinois is not obligated to ensure he gets into Illinois State, even if his grades are not good enough to get into Illinois State. An objection to Boonin's argument that we are not morally obligated to ensure that blacks receive jobs or admitted to schools ahead of more qualified white Americans is that race-neutral policies favor those who have been unfairly advantaged and disfavor those who have been unfairly disadvantaged. Boonin's response is that uncontroversially permissible race-neutral policies have this same effect. Black Americans pay the same tax rates, fines for speeding, and fines for littering. The post office charges the same amount for stamps. They are forced to comply with the same burdensome licensing requirements white people must comply with to gain work as a barber, a doctor, a pilot, etc. Another argument we have a moral duty to practice affirmative action is the value of diversity argument. Adopting affirmative action will lead to valuable benefits in the future, especially when it comes to diversity. Black students tend to come from backgrounds and have points of view that are different from typical white students. Being exposed to others from different backgrounds and points of view seem likely to have significant educational value. Now, a popular objection to the value of diversity argument is that this rests on the demeaning assumption that all black people think alike. Boonin's response to the objection to the value of diversity argument is that the assumption isn't that all black people think alike, but that, on average, blacks offer certain differences in life experiences and perspectives that differ from whites. Geography-based affirmative action is also based on generalizations. So are drinking age and voting laws. Boonin directly responds to the value of diversity argument by saying that even if diversity is valuable, we're still not morally obligated to use it. Diversity could be a contributing factor to an applicant being chosen, but that doesn't mean that there is a moral obligation for this applicant to be chosen. Another positive argument we have a moral duty to practice affirmative action is the role model argument. A steady supply of black role models can inspire and motivate younger black people if we implement racial affirmative action. Boonin objects to the role model argument by saying that there is no real evidence to support its conclusion. If there are more black teachers at medical school, will there be more black doctors? Better black doctors? While having a teacher as a role model can have a positive impact on a student's decision to pursue an academic career, the race of the teacher is irrelevant. Boonin acknowledges a counter-argument to his position that race can be a positive qualification for a position. Black students can respond better to black teachers. Black police officers can more effectively control black neighborhoods. Thus, it may make sense to hire a black applicant with less experience or fewer credentials. Boonin says that while it may seem plausible in some cases that race could be a positive qualification for a position, it's implausible in others. Black pilots or black computer programmers aren't more effective at their job simply by being black. Most supporters of affirmative action desire affirmative action across the board, not just in schools or police force. Boonin further argues that race used as a qualification can do harm to black applicants as help them. Many schools in the country have virtually no black students. Imagine the most qualified applicant who is black being told he wouldn't be good for the job because all the students there are white, and white students relate to and are more inspired by teachers of the same race. Boonin argues it's still not morally obligatory to hire black people for the sake of having inspiring role models, even if it produces positive consequences. There are, after all, things a university can do to benefit students that are not morally obligatory, like build a better library, smaller classes, new health center, better food, etc. These are all good things, but it's not immoral if the university doesn't offer them. Boonin also says that even if being black does make someone better qualified because of what they have to offer to the job in virtue of being black, such as the value of diversity or being a role model, we're still not necessarily morally obligated to hire the best. Boonin says at best we are only being unwise, not unjust, by not hiring the best. And he gives a few examples to demonstrate this. If a department chair needs to find a teacher to teach a logic course, he can pore through the hundreds of applicants to find the most qualified applicant, or he can pick a qualified enough candidate from the first 15 he reads. Boonin gives a real-life example of going to the supermarket and seeing a young lady with Down syndrome bagging groceries, not as efficiently as all the other baggers. Now, the supermarket could have hired a candidate who was a lot more efficient at bagging groceries, but they did nothing wrong in hiring the young lady with Down syndrome, even though she wasn't necessarily the best candidate. Now, an objection to this is that the woman with Down syndrome really was the best candidate because efficiency is just one qualification, and she helps the store maintain good relations with the community. Boonin sees a problem with this objection, and that's that the store would then have no moral right to hire her for genuinely altruistic reasons. A final example that Boonin gives is a white employer having his son work for him at the family business. He doesn't see it as immoral that the boss's son has passed up more qualified applicants simply because he's the boss's son, even though it may not be wise to give the top position to someone based on their birthright. Next, Boonin discusses arguments that we have a moral duty to not practice affirmative action. The first argument that Boonin addresses is that affirmative action violates white right to equal treatment. The strong version of this argument is the right to be treated in the same way as members of other races, regardless of circumstances. Boonin says we don't have this strong right to equal treatment. For example, the CIA is considering 2 candidates for an undercover assignment in an overwhelmingly black African country. The white candidate has more experience and more knowledge than the black candidate. However, there's nothing immoral about choosing the black candidate over the white candidate. Another example would be a national park auditioning 2 actors to play Abraham Lincoln. The black actor is more talented and has more experience, but the white actor gets the part. Everyone agrees it's acceptable to take race into account in the CIA undercover and Abraham Lincoln acting examples. There are those who would agree with the above examples because race is relevant. The weak version of the argument would be that the right to equal treatment means the right to be treated in the same way as members of other races, except in circumstances where differential treatment is justified or relevant. But this is precisely the question at issue. Those in favor of affirmative action believe race should be viewed as relevant. Those against affirmative action believe race should not be viewed as relevant. The opponent of affirmative action must assume what he is trying to prove. An argument we have a moral duty to not practice affirmative action is that affirmative action is discrimination against white people. It was wrong to racially discriminate against black people, and it's wrong now that it's being done to white people. Boonin says discrimination is taking place in two different contexts. Discrimination against blacks took place in the context of white majorities' contempt for and feelings of superiority to the black minority. However, the way affirmative action discriminates is not done out of contempt for white people. Another argument we have a moral duty to not practice affirmative action is that the government is terrible with racial distinctions. Policies that have treated people differently in the past have led to injustice. Boonin says, because something was done incorrectly in the past does not mean there is no good reason to do it correctly today, even though we have reason to do so cautiously. The government has a bad track record with all sorts of distinctions. For example, adult and child, citizen and non-citizen, innocent and guilty, mentally competent and incompetent. In all these cases, distinctions were misused, but that does not mean the government should stop utilizing such distinctions. And while there may be negative consequences of affirmative action, that doesn't mean that it's immoral. An argument we have a moral duty to not practice affirmative action is that affirmative action has a stigmatizing effect on those it's trying to help. If everyone on a college campus knows the black students there were admitted under a relaxed set of standards relative to white students, the argument maintains that two things are likely going to happen. One, white students will think less of the black students. Two, black students will think less of themselves. Boonin says even if there is this stigmatizing effect, it doesn't mean that affirmative action is unjust. Consider the practice of many universities admitting athletes under academic standards that are relaxed relative to the standards that are applied to non-athletes. The same is true for legacies and geography-based forms of affirmative action. An argument we have a moral duty to not practice affirmative action is that affirmative action leads to division. Boonin says affirmative action is a divisive topic, but so is the abortion controversy. Why should someone abandon their cause for an issue simply because there are those who strongly disagree? Whether affirmative action is promoted or abandoned, many people will be angry about the outcome. An argument we have a moral duty to not practice affirmative action is that affirmative action fails to benefit some of those who deserve to be benefited, but it also tends to benefit those who are least disadvantaged members of a group and does nothing for the most disadvantaged members of the group. Boonin says this is true for someone who applies to an Ivy League school, but not for those applying for less prestigious colleges or jobs. Boonin believes affirmative action policies don't just benefit those who end up getting hired, but it is made easier for all blacks to increase their chances of success. The next topic that Boonin discusses in his textbook is hate speech. A hate speech refers to verbal or written attacks on people that target them because of their group membership, where this at least includes race or ethnicity, and may well include other characteristics like religion, gender, and sexual orientation. A hate speech restriction is a rule or set of rules that prohibit such speech. A hate speech restriction is a policy by which a government or university singles out a set of verbal or written attacks that target people by race and prohibits them because they are verbal or written attacks that target people by race. Boonin finds hate speech laws morally objectionable because they prohibit people from saying certain things without a sufficiently good reason for the prohibition. Boonin sees hate speech as distinct from hate crimes. People tend to see hate speech restrictions and hate crime laws as rising and falling together. But Boonin disagrees. Now, a popular justification in favor of hate speech laws is that hate speech is threatening. Boonin says justifying hate speech restrictions based on hate speech being threatening is impaled on the horns of a dilemma. Either the appeal is unconvincing, because not all hate speech is threatening, or hate speech is inherently threatening, and there are already laws to prohibit threatening people. An example of not all hate speech being threatening is the N-word being used as a threat in some, but not all cases. An elderly white woman in a wheelchair shouting the N-word at a group of healthy young black men poses no threat to their well-being. An objection to Boonin saying that not all hate speech is threatening is that non-threatening uses of hate speech contribute to an environment that leads to hate speech flourishing. Boonin sees this as having implications that all would reject. For example, a student saying that abortion is morally on par with murder can't reasonably be construed as a threat against anybody, but it could provide motivation to inspire other people to make and carry out threats against those who provide abortions. Since we agree that a student should have a legal right to say that abortion is murder, even if we disagree with his opinion, we should reject the objection that non-threatening uses of hate speech lead to threatening uses of hate speech when it comes to justifying hate speech laws. Another argument in favor of hate speech laws is that fighting words that tend to incite an immediate breach of the peace can be unobjectionably morally restricted. Therefore, so can hate speech. Boonin says the problem with this objection is it permits people to make otherwise protected expression forbidden simply by making themselves incited to breach the peace by it. It seems morally problematic to give people the right to engage in such selective censorship. Imagine being forced to cancel your egalitarian picnic because a group of racists made a point of showing up just so they could be incited to violence by proclaiming the virtues of racial equality. Boonin says a second worry about the fighting words doctrine concerns its implications for personal responsibility. It deprives the victim of the responsibility to respond peacefully. Boonin says the hate speech laws based on fighting words only protects those who are strong enough to retaliate and breach the peace, while a nun, monk, or elderly woman who does not have the strength or will to retaliate are left unprotected. Another argument in favor of hate speech laws is that hate speech involves words that wound. Those on the receiving end of hate speech can be deeply wounded. Victims can receive feelings of humiliation, isolation, self-hatred, mental illness, heightened blood pressure, hypertension, rapid pulse rate, difficulty breathing, nightmares, even suicide and financial harms. Boonin says the problem with introducing a new category of hate speech based on the fact that words can wound is that it would ban too many things that should not be banned. For example, someone who tells their brother he hates him and never wants to see him again. Or another example, most would agree that pro and anti-war protesters should be legally permitted to shout traitor or murderer when they engage one another at rallies, even though saying these words can deeply wound the individual it's aimed at. A criticism of Boonin is that one can think of sorts of cases where speech is so horrific and the grief that follows so devastating that government intervention can be justified. Boonin responds that one can sue someone for intentional infliction of emotional distress without the need to construct hate speech laws. An argument in favor of hate speech laws is that hate speech can subordinate people when it's done in a domineering way, leading to people being placed in or feeling as if they've been placed in a subordinate position. Boonin says this has the implication that certain speech should be allowed based on whether or not enough people take the person speaking seriously enough to make them feel as if they've been placed in a subordinate position. For example, a university would suspend a student based on if the student was a popular class leader whose words have authority, or if he was a widely ignored loner. An argument in favor of hate speech laws is that hate speech deprives others of their free speech. Hate speech has a silencing effect that discourages those it's aimed at from speaking up for themselves. In the end, hate speech leads to fewer people being compelled to speak freely. In response, Boonin says there are examples of speech having a silencing effect on those it is aimed at that nearly everyone agrees should not be banned. For example, a preacher from the pulpit saying in the strongest terms that abortion is murder. This makes a woman in the congregation who would otherwise be inclined to voice her concern reluctant to do so. Or the example of a student on a campus where most people support abortion rights, saying that only dumb religious zealots oppose abortion, causing the small minority of students who oppose abortion to be less comfortable in sharing their opinions. An argument in favor of hate speech laws is that hate speech also can lead to people no longer taking seriously who the hateful words are aimed at. For example, hate speech aimed at black people will lead to black people's opinions not being taken seriously. Even if hate speech doesn't prevent people from desiring to speak freely, it can prevent people from actively listening to them. Boonin says there are many forms of speech that aim to take an individual's words less seriously, that we do not find objectionable. For example, speech that seeks to attack another person's credentials. This speech is designed to take their words less seriously. Or the example of speech that aims to attribute ulterior motives to people, like saying abortion opponents are really trying to punish women, or saying Planned Parenthood's defense of abortion rights is really motivated by a desire for profit. Next, Boonin moves on in his text to discuss hate crime laws. A hate crime law is a law that takes an ordinary crime, like arson or assault, and adds an extra amount of punishment to the crime when the crime is committed not simply as a crime, but as a hate crime. For example, an arsonist burns down a building and selects it because of its convenient location. This is a crime, but not a hate crime. In order for it to be a hate crime, the arsonist would have to select his victim for a reason that has to do with the beliefs about the victim's group membership, like being black. Boonin investigates what constitutes a hate crime. Does the race of the arsonist matter? If a black arsonist victimizes a fellow black person out of self-hatred or an inferiority complex, is it still considered a hate crime? Does it have to be a majority group member attacking a minority group member? Does it matter if a black person is targeting out of hatred for black people? What if the arsonist doesn't have any negative feelings towards black people, but simply chooses to burn down black families' homes because the police will not investigate it as thoroughly or less likely to have a good security system? Boonin's justification for hate crime laws is that hate crimes are worse than ordinary crimes. Worse crimes merit greater punishments. Therefore, hate crimes merit greater punishments. Boonin's justification for the first premise of his argument, that hate crimes are worse than ordinary crimes, is that you would feel worse if you were the victim of a hate crime in the same trauma that wasn't a hate crime. So you would feel worse having your house burnt down because you were black rather than because it was in a convenient location. Boonin says the presence of something extra can make the crime worse. So for example, armed robbery versus unarmed robbery. Armed robbery is merely the presence of something extra, a weapon. But the crime becomes worse due to this additional factor. He says a criminal act can be worse through a worse state of mind.
So for instance, the mental state involved in the killing carried out by a professional hitman is worse than the killing carried out to avenge a serious wrong. Boonin points out hate crimes don't just harm the victim, but the victim's entire community. If an ordinary arsonist burns down someone's house, his act is an assault against his particular victim, but not against anyone else. If an arsonist deliberately sets out to burn down a particular house because a black family lives in it, his act is taken to be an offense not just against the victim, but against other black families in the community. It also could lead to retaliatory violence and rioting. An objection to the second premise of Boonin's argument is that irrational beliefs should not be taken into account by law. It's irrational to care about one's race any more than that one is left or right-handed. Why should the law take into account someone's irrational beliefs when determining the severity of crimes? Boonin's response is that even if it is irrational to feel worse for being targeted for being black than targeted randomly, and that it's irrational to care more about your race than eye color, what matters is that most people will have these wounded feelings, not that they are justified. Another objection to Boonin's second premise is that hate crimes being worse than ordinary crimes is an overgeneralization. Boonin's response is that a hate crime law doesn't say that every hate crime merits a harsher punishment than every ordinary crime. It says that every hate crime merits a harsher punishment than would be given for an ordinary crime that is exactly like that particular hate crime. So for example, a racially motivated vandal shouldn't have a harsher punishment than a greedy murderer. An objection to the second premise of Boonin's argument is that hate crimes are unconstitutional thought crimes. Punishing a hate crime more than a parallel ordinary crime would be punishing the criminal for his objectionable thoughts. And everyone agrees that the government shouldn't punish people simply for having bad thoughts. Boonin responds saying the law takes thoughts into account when determining levels of punishment all the time. For instance, the difference between first-degree murder and negligent homicide. Two people are each found to have dropped a heavy rock off the top of a tall building and killing someone. The first person did it to kill his business rival. The second person just wanted to hear the sound of the rock hitting the ground, but didn't look carefully enough to see that no one was beneath him. Virtually everyone agrees the first rock dropper should receive a harsher punishment than the second rock dropper. The example of criminal conspiracy, involving a group of guys sitting around with tools and develop written plans to rob a bank. What makes what they're doing illegal is their intention. They can be punished for their thoughts without acting on them yet. The example of sentencing for the death penalty. Murder for political opportunism is typically viewed worse than one motivated by revenge. Another objection to the second premise of Boonin's argument is that hate crime laws are unjust due to the lack of control and formation of deep-seated beliefs. It's not really possible for a bigot to simply change such a deep-seated attitude at a moment's notice. So for instance, an anti-Semitic vandal who throws a rock through his Jewish neighbor's window because he's Jewish is receiving an extra punishment for something that is outside of his control. He simply can't decide to stop his deep-seated hatred of Jewish people. Boonin says the bigoted vandal is punished for throwing the rock, not for the anti-Semitic intention. The bigot is punished for acting on his ideology, not for having it. There are a variety of cases where the law adds extra punishment for factors that are beyond the offender's control the moment that he freely chooses to violate the law. For instance, with repeat offenders, at the time they commit the crime, they have no control over whether it would be their first offense. Or the example of provoked versus unprovoked assault. The person has no control over whether or not the stranger had provoked him, but does have control over hitting him. Thus, the arsonist who targets by race gets a greater punishment not because he has objectionable beliefs, but because he selects his victims in a manner that is objectionable. Another objection to Boonin's second premise is the double jeopardy objection, that hate crime laws punish a person twice for the same crime. The arsonist who targets by race receives a 3-year sentence for burning down a black family's house, and an additional 2-year sentence for the very same act with the intent behind the act. Boonin responds that hate crime laws don't punish the assaulter once for assault and then a second time for prejudice assault. They simply punish him once for prejudice assault and punish him more for it than they would with ordinary assault. Another objection to Boonin's second premise is the enforcement of hate crime laws could inhibit people from expressing their ideas. Anyone who expresses hateful ideas could have their hateful expressions used as evidence that any ordinary arson or ordinary assault was really a hate crime rather than an ordinary crime. Boonin sees it as extremely unlikely that the average bigot will hesitate before speaking because what they say will be used against them in their sentencing when they commit future felonies. The law could also simply adopt a rule that renders evidence of such previous statements inadmissible in court. If hate crime laws should be rejected because they may discourage people from expressing certain unpopular views, then anti-discrimination laws should be rejected for the same reason, says Boonin. Should we get rid of anti-discrimination laws because it prevents employers from voicing their bigoted comments towards blacks? Of course not. An objection to Boonin's second premise is that hate crime laws are impractical since juries can only guess the motives of criminals. Boonin acknowledges it can be difficult for a jury to decipher the motives and intentions of a criminal. However, if we can't have laws where juries have to guess the motive of criminals, we would have to get rid of laws dealing with anti-discrimination and laws pertaining to breaking into a person's house to steal rather than get out of the rain. These all involve a jury determining intention. An objection to the second premise of Boonin's argument is what groups merit special protection? Crimes motivated by religion, race, national origin, sexual orientation, etc. should involve harsher punishment. But where is the line drawn? Do we give out harsher punishments for those who burn down a house because it ends in an even number, or because they like grapes? Boonin says people don't identify with their addresses or food preferences in the way most people identify with their race. Boonin acknowledges the difficulty of knowing precisely what crimes count as hate crimes. A thug who assaults people because they're homeless, a high school bully who attacks nerds. Does Scientology or atheism count as a hate crime based on religion? Boonin says this isn't a reason to reject hate crime laws because line drawing difficulties exist. Line drawing difficulties exist in the entire law. For instance, with anti-discrimination law, or consent in rape cases, or self-defense and murder. The next topic that Boonin takes on in his text is racial profiling. Racial profiling is defined as the use of race as at least one factor in determining how thoroughly to investigate people, independent of any questions about how they are treated when they are investigated. Typically, race is used as one factor among many others, including sex, age, physical appearance, type of clothes and jewelry, presence of tattoos, demeanor, etc. Boonin acknowledges there are many examples of abusive police behavior that occur when there is racial profiling used on the police force. An example would be unreasonable search and seizure, with a cop telling a young black man to empty his pockets and backpack when all he is doing is walking down the street of a white neighborhood. Boonin is looking at the subject of racial profiling in itself, theoretically independent of abuses that occur. Boonin makes the distinction between irrational racial profiling and immoral racial profiling. To say that racial profiling is irrational is to say that it is an ineffective policy and should be opposed for those reasons. To say racial profiling is immoral is to say that even if racial profiling is reasonable,
It is unethical nonetheless and should be rejected because it is immoral. Boonin argues that racial profiling is rational. He says that blacks, on average, are more likely to commit certain types of crimes than other races, and it's rational for police to adopt policies that will enable them to apprehend more offenders. To support the first premise of his argument, Boonin says that while Black Americans make up approximately 13% of the population, they account for 27.9% of all arrests, including 36.8% of all arrests for weapons violations and 34.5% of all drug abuse violations. An objection to Boonin's first premise is that there is data that black and white drivers are guilty of illegally possessing drugs, guns, or other pieces of incriminating evidence at virtually the same rate. Boonin says hit rates may be more equal precisely because of racial profiling. Police are more hesitant to pull over white people unless they see something suspicious, while black people are being pulled over at random. Thus, when blacks know they're under investigation and are more greatly scrutinized, they are still offending at the same rate when whites believe they are under far less scrutiny. Boonin also responds, saying that it is true that the probability that a search driver is found carrying any amount of contraband is very similar across races. But when we look at the probability that a search driver is carrying contraband in excess of high threshold, it is not equal. The hit rate is 4 times higher for black drivers than white drivers when it comes to possession of contraband that constitutes a felony rather than a misdemeanor. An objection to Boonin's first premise is that it's based off of an overgeneralization. Racial profiling is based on generalizations, but there are clearly many exceptions to generalizations. Think of the example of a black Sunday school teacher and a white drug dealer heading down the turnpike. The white driver is more likely to be carrying illegal drugs. Boonin says that if a black Sunday school teacher and a white drug addict both speed past a cop who's pulled over on the side of the road, the cop can see which one is white and which one is black, but he can't see which one is a Sunday school teacher and which is a drug addict. The cop can only pull over based on limited information available. The rational thing to do is to base which driver to pull over on averages. Boonin says in order for the first premise of his argument to work, it has to claim only that there is a difference between the two on average. An objection to Boonin saying that blacks are more likely to break the law is that blacks appear statistically more likely to break the law because cops are more eager to search for blacks breaking the law. Boonin sees some truth to the data being skewed because cops are going after blacks, and he believes that white arrests would likely go up and black arrests go down without racial profiling. However, Boonin thinks there would still be significantly more black than white crimes of particular types if there was no racial profiling. He justifies this through crime reports on robbery, assault, and rape, where the victim is able to give a description of the offender. Roughly twice the amount of black Americans are committing these crimes as the population as a whole. An objection that Boonin addresses is that decreased scrutiny of whites leads to higher white crime. The decreased scrutiny of white people will encourage a greater number of white people to break the law who otherwise would not break it and get away with it due to the lack of scrutiny. On average, black Americans who break the law are more likely to be doing so because they see themselves as having few alternatives. Thus, they'll continue to break the law out of desperation even when the police spend extra energy investigating them. However, white people, on average, will have more to lose by breaking the law, so their higher scrutiny will deter their lawbreaking. Boonin responds to the objection that decreased scrutiny of whites through racial profiling will lead to higher white crime by saying that racial profiling can be modified so that it's only used in circumstances when it doesn't increase overall crime. An objection is that rational racial profiling is practiced by irrational people. Even if racial profiling is reasonable, officers who practice racial profiling can mistakenly put too great of an emphasis on race in their analysis of potential criminals. Officers can put so much emphasis on race, they overlook other important factors in identifying a criminal. Boonin agrees that human imperfection can make utilizing racial profiling more harmful than helpful. However, it's also possible to utilize it in a way that is more beneficial, even with our human imperfections. Boonin's text next moves on to a distinct question from is racial profiling irrational to is racial profiling immoral? Even if some racial profiling is rational, that doesn't mean that it would be okay to engage in it. Boonin's position is that rational racial profiling is morally acceptable. His reasoning is it's good to protect people from crime. The people who are being investigated are being investigated on independent grounds, and placing extra scrutiny on people of certain races is acceptable because there may not be enough time to investigate everyone or every person with equal thoroughness. An objection to Boonin's position that racial profiling can be morally acceptable is that racial profiling violates human right to freedom from unreasonable search and seizure. Boonin says the claim a particular person has a right to not be searched unless there is good reason to think a particular person is guilty of something must be rejected. For example, airports thoroughly search each person without reason to believe that person is guilty of any crime. Many airports have a policy of randomly picking out a select subset of people passing through and subjecting them to a substantially more thorough search. And virtually everyone agrees that this is morally acceptable, even though there is no reason to believe they are guilty of a crime. The cases of random sobriety checkpoints and border searches further show it could be morally permissible for a security officer to search a person without reason to think he is guilty of anything. Boonin gives an example of police seeking out a black suspect in a crime as rationally supporting heightened scrutiny of innocent blacks, including in cases involving racial profiling. In the event that a physical description of a suspect has been given in a robbery case by the sole witness that the suspect is a black male, it would be uncontroversially morally permissible to set up roadblocks along possible getaway routes and subject black male drivers to greater degree of scrutiny. There is no plausible reason to think that each individual black person receiving heightened scrutiny had done anything wrong. They merely fit an imperfect description of the suspect. If the right against unreasonable search and seizure makes racial profiling immoral, it would make taking race into account in this situation immoral as well, even when it's probabilistically relevant. An objection against Boonin is that even rationally based racial profiling has negative consequences. Racial profiling will generate a negative attitude of some sort toward the police and the legal system in general. Black Americans will feel resentment for being treated with such scrutiny. Black people may feel discouraged from moving around in public for fear of being unjustifiably targeted by the police. They may be deterred from living in a predominantly white neighborhood. Black jurors may be less likely to believe the sworn testimony of police officers. Black people will be less likely to get involved in police investigations. Boonin's response is that if a cop is engaging in racial profiling, but no one is aware of this fact, then none of the negative consequences the objection appeals to will occur. An objection to Boonin's response is that how could it be kept a secret, especially if it's done on a large scale? Boonin says it isn't obvious which departments practice racial profiling.
looking at statistics about which groups are being pulled over, investigated, or arrested at what rates can't provide an answer without knowing why they're being pulled over at those rates. It's hard to know what percentage of drivers on a given highway are black, and how many white, and what percentage end up speeding. How is it knowable what the officer's intention was, and if there were other drivers of a different color he could have pulled over? How can drivers themselves know if they were profiled when being pulled over? Boonin says even if racial profiling has negative consequences, it wouldn't make racial profiling immoral. If enough people become strongly opposed to racial profiling could be unworkable and unwise to adopt. But this is true of any policy. An objection that Boonin takes on is that racial profiling is unfair because it disproportionately burdens Black Americans. Boonin sympathetically acknowledges this, but he sees the benefits of racial profiling also being disproportionately benefiting Black Americans. Black Americans are more often victims of crime. Racial profiling leads to safer environments for both whites and blacks. Not using racial profiling would mean that more people, both white and black, will be burdened by thorough police searches to attain the number of arrests that racial profiling effectively achieves in less time and fewer people being searched. Black people are also disproportionately burdened in the use of race in physical suspect descriptions, but hardly anyone sees this as unfair or immoral. An objection is that racial profiling disproportionately places Black Americans in prison. Boonin's response is that this is because a disproportionate number of Black people are committing certain sorts of crimes. He says the goal is to reduce the rate all people are breaking laws, not to reduce how many Black people get caught in order to even the playing field. An objection is that rational and statistically based racial profiling is merely an excuse to harass innocent Black people and get away with it. Boonin says that even if people utilize rational racial profiling to harass innocent Black people and get away with it, this objection fails to show that there is anything wrong with racial profiling in itself. Boonin says even though it can be demonstrated that racial profiling is morally permissible, it does not follow from that racial profiling is morally obligatory. While the state has a special obligation to protect its citizens from crime, there is not a moral obligation to engage in racial profiling. A parent is obligated to care for a young child, but that doesn't mean the parent must do every little thing possible to ensure the child's safety. The state has a duty to protect its citizens, but it can still provide a high level of safety without racial profiling. For example, to protect its citizens, the state could add extra police cars on the road to gain more arrests instead of adopting racial profiling.